ravi de vous rencontrer, professeur. Pourriez-vous vous présenter, s'il vous plaît?
Okay, my name is Bogdan Jaroszewicz. I'm a researcher working in the Geobotanical Station of the University of Warsaw. I'm based for the last 30 years in Bialowieza forest. At the beginning I was working for the national park, and then for the last 16 years I am leading the Geobotanical Station. And my main work is about the forest ecology and, well, generally ecology is about the interactions between different groups of organisms and their environment. And that's exactly what we are studying here.
Pouvez-vous nous expliquer plus précisément ce que vous étudiez ici? Qu'est-ce que la géobotanique, par exemple?
Geobotany is generally about the plants, their distribution in let's say, geographical scales, and about ecology of plants. Okay. But, plants cannot, in a matter of fact, they cannot operate without animals. Of course, for most of us, when we talk about such interactions, animals are the factors which are rather bringing harm to plants. I mean, they eat plants, but it's not true. Animals are very important also as partners of plants, starting with the pollination, which is the most obvious. And there are also many other services, like, for example, seed dispersal by birds, by large herbivores, which are simply serving as seed vectors of plants. So they're responsible for distribution of plants in ecosystems, as well as less obvious interactions, like, for example, the so-called landscape of fear, so influence of wolves on the herbivores, which causes, or which, let's say, regulates possibilities of regeneration of forest trees. So sometimes such interactions are not so obvious, and they are cascading, and very often quite difficult to follow. And we are trying to cope a little bit with all of these subjects.
Et quels types d'interactions sont les plus présentes dans la forêt? Des interactions de compétition ou de coopération? Ou peut-être les deux, d'ailleurs.
I would say that we can't say that any one of these interactions is prevailing. Simply depends on about which species we are talking. Okay. So in case of some pairs of species you will have many competition, but in case of competition, then we are talking about the similar organisms, taxonomically similar organisms. Yes, so birds may compete with birds or some other animals for food. Okay. Plants can compete between themselves for light, for nutrients, and so on. While cooperation is much, in my opinion, is much wider. Of course, we may say that plants also cooperate with each other. There are many studies which are showing that, for example, plants may pass some information between the individuals, but also between the species. Okay. But in case of plant-animal interactions, such a cooperation allows for plants to travel simply, because plants usually they are rooted and they can't move. Yeah. So transport of seeds or transport of pollen grains for fertilization of flowers, that's the only way in which plant genes may travel from place to place.
Et justement, en parlant d'interaction, en parlant de pollinisation, à votre avis, du coup, c'est l'abeille qui utilise plus la fleur ou la fleur qui utilise plus l'abeille?
Well, there are all of such, let's say, shades of cooperation. Usually, in case of pollination, it's mutual, let's say, interactions. I mean, both sides have benefits. Flower is pollinated by pollens from other individuals, so it increases genetic diversity of population. But on the other hand, insect feeds on pollen or nectar. But very often some plants are using insects, they are cheating them. And in our forest, that's a case of some orchids, which in the matter of fact do not offer nectar to insects, but when insects are attracted to flower, they are then carrying pollen to the next flowers. So insects in the matter of fact have nothing out of it, and flower have all of the benefits. Okay. But on the other hand, there are some insects which are cheating flowers as well. So for example, if flower has a very deep displays with the nectar, then insects sometimes, not all of the insects can reach to the nectar. But for example, bumblebees can wrap the flower by making a hole from the side of the flower. And in such a case, flower doesn't receive any benefits, and nectar is consumed.
It's like a play of each individual want to have his benefit, but sometimes it's only for one of individual.
Yes, but then you can expand this, let's say, these conclusions not just on individuals, but also on species. Okay. Because that's part of the adaptation and part of the evolution of species, co-evolution of species.
Une autre interaction dont vous nous avez parlé tout à l'heure, c'est l'échange d'informations entre les plantes. Comment cela est possible?
You know, in the temperate forests, such studies are not very common. So I can't give you exact examples from our forest about such interactions. But I think that the most well-known such example is from the African savanna, where acacias, if they are eaten by giraffes or other large mammals, they start to emit to the air some chemical components, and these components are then received by other trees of acacia, and that's a warning signal that they are attacked. And then these acacias can prepare themselves, can remove some substances from leaves and make them less palatable or less tasty. On the other hand, it was also proven that giraffes, for example, learn it. They know it, so they, when they start to feed, they go against the wind. Yeah. So these chemicals are brought behind them.
They understand the trick and they
exactly.
make a move
but
escape to it.
Yeah, then we again are talking about the co-evolution and adaptation of both species to these interactions, which is in this case beneficial just for one side.
Yeah. Vous nous parlez de coévolution, c'est très intéressant ici, parce qu'à Bialowieza, la forêt elle a eu le temps d'évoluer par elle-même du coup pendant des milliers d'années. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner des exemples d'espèces qui auraient coévolué ensemble, des espèces représentatives?
You know, if you choose any pair of species which are connected, that's a good example. But of course, we cannot talk about the evolution just in the scale of one forest. Yeah. Evolution is the process which usually takes place in much wider geographical scale. But coming back to Bialowieza forest, the pair of species which is causing very hot discussions is the spruce, Pitia abies, and European spruce bark beetle, so the beetle which attacks spruces and kills them if they are weak and if they are vulnerable for attacks of these beetles. And well, from the ecological point of view, both species certainly coevoluted together, and we may say that each forest with the spruces contain also spruce bark beetles. And because these both species are living together for thousands or maybe even millions of years, they are, well, there is no danger that, for example, all of the spruces will be killed by bark beetle, because then the bark beetle, as a species which fits only on the tree, on this tree, will die as well. And this is a very controversial, let's say, pair of species, because from the economic point of view, from the point of view of forest management, this bark beetle is considered a pest. By the way, we don't use in ecology such a term as pest, because it's simply economical term, not ecological. In ecology, each species has its role, and in this case, simply this bark beetle is responsible for elimination of those individuals of spruces which are weak, which are dying anyway.
Vous nous parlez d'arbres qui meurent, et d'ailleurs c'est un élément vraiment représentatif de cette forêt, c'est la quantité de bois mort au sol. Est-ce que c'est bien de voir du bois mort au sol dans une forêt?
I would say it's a sign of the healthy forest, opposite to what very often people think. Healthy forests are not those which are cleaned of the dead wood, cleaned of the weak trees. Because deadwood offers a very unique kind of the substrate on which develop many species of invertebrates, but also fungi. Some of them are very important for keeping the forest in equilibrium. Coming back to this example of spruce and spruce bark beetle, many parasites, many predators which are hunting the bark beetles are developing under the bark of dead spruces. So if foresters remove them from the forest, they remove also the predators and parasites. So in the matter of fact, they decrease natural forces which can keep forest ecosystem in the balance.
It's like if you exploit the forest, more you exploit the forest, and more you your forest became weak because you cut the balance in the forest.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, there are also many studies which are showing that biodiversity, generally the number of species, is very important for stability of ecosystems. Of course, there are ecosystems also like, for example, desert ecosystems, which do not include many species and they are stable. But in case of forests, generally we may say that the more diverse a forest is, the more stable and the more resilient it is. In case of deadwood, it was estimated that in temperate forests, 30 to 50% of animals are connected directly or indirectly to the deadwood. So if all of the deadwood is removed from the forest, we are losing at least 1/3 of our fauna. And definitely it must have influence on forest operation.
Well, we can say the deadwood is a big part, important part of wild forest. We can create or develop wild forest without deadwood. It's not impossible.
Of course not. Of course, it's one of the measures of naturalness of forest. Because I understand that when you talk about the wild forest, you think about something what is called natural or primeval forest, or old growth in some cases.
Et d'ailleurs, qui décompose le bois mort?
Okay, so the deadwood is mostly mostly decomposed by fungi. And of course it, let's say, works both ways, because fungi are dependent on deadwood. Then the more deadwood we have in the forest, the more fungi species are present. In case of core area of the Bialowieza National Park, which is, let's say, about 5,000 hectares, there are already recorded over 2,000 species of macrofungi. Macrofungi are those which are visible with naked eyes. And that means about quarter of all of the European species of macrofungi, concentrated on just 5,000 hectares of forest. Okay. So it shows how important is deadwood. But deadwood is, I would say, a buzzword recently in ecology, in the sense that it suggests that deadwood is the one category. But in the matter of fact, deadwood has also the inner diversity. It's very important for organisms which are using deadwood, also fungi which break down deadwood. What is the species of the tree which died? What is the size of this tree, or it was a size? What is the position of deadwood in the forest? I mean, if this is standing deadwood or lying on the ground or hanging on other trees. It's also important how the tree died. Because if, for example, we can imagine the healthy tree which was broken by the wind, then it includes a lot of nutrients. And it's much more attractive for invertebrates and fungi than the tree which, for example, died because it was under canopy of other trees. So in the matter of fact, it died because of the starvation, because then it is much poorer into nutrients. And different species of invertebrates and fungi will settle on each of such deadwood types.
Okay, very interesting. It's like the way they die, they attract other cortege of animals.
Yes, it also it's one of the factors influencing the species composition of organisms which then colonize such a piece of deadwood. But aside of the fungi, some role is played also by bacteria. Bacteria also may break the wood, but they are more sensitive for humidity of the deadwood and not so efficient in breaking down celluloses. So their role is not as important as in case of fungi.
Qu'est-ce que la décomposition du bois, elle apporte à la forêt, au sol de la forêt?
I think it needs to be stressed that without the decomposition, nor of the forest would work. I mean, natural forest or commercial forest needs decomposition, because decomposition brings back nutrients from leaves which are falling down each autumn in our climate back to the soil, and then they can be reused by plants. And in case of deadwood doesn't include so much nutrients as leaves. Deadwood is much poorer in nitrogen, in calcium and other substances. But still, because the volume of deadwood is very large, then in the scale of, let's say, 1 hectare of the natural forest, many nutrients are stored in wood of the living trees, and when they die, then slowly with the process of decomposition, they're coming back to the soil. And that's the main role of the fungi in the ecosystem, in the forest ecosystem. Without the fungi, we would have just piles of dead trees, and the other trees, with the time, would use all of the nutrients, and the soil will become not fertile anymore. But owing to this decaying process, nutrients are coming back to soil. But it's also worth to stress that dead wood usually is not decomposed in 100%. I mean, some components are fixed into the long-term, well, not long-term, but into the biochemical components which are living for a very, very long time, for decades. For example, fulvic acids, and there are many other such substances which then are stored in the soil, and they fix, for example, carbon for decades or for centuries in the forest soil. So recently, this function of the forest is very important, that it's not just circulating the nutrients, but also at least carbon is stored for a very long time in the soils. And the speed of decomposition depends generally on climatic conditions, but also on tree species. There are trees like, for example, oak or pine, which are decomposing very slowly because their wood is filled with the chemical substances which are inhibiting development of fungi. In case of oak, these are tannins. In case of pine, these are resins. And that makes the wood very durable. Many other species are decomposing much faster. But according to our studies here in the core area of the national park, let's say most of the tree species of the average size disappears from the forest floor after 30 to 40 years. So after such a time, you don't see anything atop of the soil. Still, if you dig to the soil, you'll find the layer of the reddish substance which is rest over of such a trunk which was decomposed.
Okay. Donc le bois mort, il permet à la fois de rendre des nutriments au sol, mais de stocker du carbone. Et pour faire une comparaison entre une forêt exploitée et une forêt sauvage, qu'est-ce qu'il en est du carbone dans une forêt exploitée où on enlève tout le bois mort par rapport à une forêt sauvage?
Yes, and these studies showed that in commercial forest, of course, it fixes the carbon. If it is a young planted forest, it fixes also even carbon quite quickly. But generally, with the wood which we take from the commercial forest, we remove carbon from the ecosystem. And it doesn't mean that we store this carbon, because a very small percentage of the wood is used in the way which assures durability of such a storage. I mean, just a small percentage of wood is used for building of buildings, for example. So then such a wood stays undecomposed for decades, sometimes centuries. Most of the wood is used for production of paper or other products which are short-living, which are living just a few months or a few years. So after a few years, most of the carbon from the wood extracted from commercial forest is back to the atmosphere. While in the natural forest, this carbon, even if during decomposition it slowly is going back to the air, but not 100% of the carbon, as I said, is extracted back to the air, because some is stored for a very long time in the soil. But also we must take into account that decomposition is the biological process. So some percentage of the carbon is certainly built into the bodies of fungi or insects, and it stays and circulates in the ecosystem. It's a very complicated process, and in a matter of fact, I don't have in mind any study which would calculate really the rate of this turnover of carbon, including time when it is stored in the fungi, in insects, and so on.
It's very interesting because when we talk about forest, for a urban forest, it's like we talk about tree, but when we talk about wild forest, we talk about the whole ecosystem and not only tree stock carbon, all the ecosystem stock carbon.
Yeah, but you know, it's I would say it's something which is true for in case of the most of the people which are, let's say, not specialists. But in the matter of fact, each forest is the ecosystem. Yeah. We must learn to see the forest behind the trees.
Pour nous aider à voir la forêt derrière l'arbre, pouvez-vous comparer pour nous les forêts exploitées en termes de biodiversité et les forêts sauvages?
I can't give you exact numbers. Yeah, exactly, because of course it changes from region to region, and from type of the forest to type of the forest. These differences are very different for, let's say, coniferous forests. Yeah. For example, pine forests, even if they are quite natural, they are quite poor in species by their nature, because they grow usually in extreme habitats on dry sandy soils and so on. Of course, still natural pine forests will include many more species of fungi or other deadwood dependent organisms. But the difference between the natural pine forest and commercial pine forests, in my opinion, is much lower than between mixed deciduous forests, like here in Bialowieza forest, and commercial deciduous forests. Because from the starting, when foresters plant the forest, they usually choose mainly species which are useful, because if we are talking about the commercial forests, they have economic reason to exist. So some tree species are very often not included into species composition. In case of this region, such a species would be, for example, linden, tilia, which don't have high commercial value because wood is soft, is quickly deteriorating, and so on. So for the centuries in Central Europe, but I think also in Western Europe, lindens were locked in the forest but not replanted. So in effect, when I am showing this forest for people which are coming here for touristic reason or for scientists, they are surprised that there are so many lindens in the forest. In the core area, locally, they can even dominate the wood stand. They say they see these species just in the parks, in the alleys, along the streets and so on, but not in the forest. But this is effect of human management. Simply species which are not really useful were eradicated, and we are using usually just so-called good species. So let's say 4 main species: pine, spruce, oak, and beech. Of course, now situation is changing, and even commercial forests are becoming more diverse. But we must keep in mind that forest life cycle is very long. So these changes which were made by our management during the previous centuries will be visible in the future for several more centuries. this change, which increases diversity of commercial forest recently, will benefit next generation of humans. For us, we can just observe and hope that this trend will be still on.
Et justement, pour les générations futures, combien de temps un arbre dans une forêt exploitée vit-il en moyenne? Et combien de temps les arbres peuvent vivre dans une forêt sauvage comme celle de Bialowieza?
Okay, so it again depends on the species, yes? Because even in natural forest, species differ by their maximum life expectancy. Usually we say that oaks are the longest living species, at least here in this part of the Europe. So oaks may live 600-700 years in Bialowieza forest. That's what we estimate as a maximum. And in commercial forests, they're usually logged in the age of 100 years, 120. So it means 6 to 7-fold longer natural life cycle than the commercial one. But in case of, for example, birch, which is short-living species, the difference is just like, let's say, 1 to 2. I mean, birches are logged usually in quite young age, about 60, 70 years, but they live maximally 120, 150 years. So, you know, I very often say that in ecology, usually the most correct answer is it depends.
On a parlé de l'âge des arbres, mais d'ailleurs, qu'est-ce qu'apportent les vieux arbres à la forêt?
Whoa, you know, old trees is a completely different story. Okay. I mean, without old trees, in my opinion, we can't talk about the forest, just about the plantation. Because in the matter of fact, indeed, the commercial forests are plantations, not really forests, because they are not allowed to fulfill the whole life cycle of the forest. And old trees are very important because standing in one place, they are influencing their surroundings very often for centuries. And this influence is on one side direct, I mean physically they occupy some area, so they don't allow for development of other trees, they shade the regeneration, they are hosts for many other organisms which live on old trees, starting with the insects and fungi, but also many old trees are important for birds, especially for woodpeckers. And there are also a lot of indirect influences, like, for example, all of the trees excrete some chemicals which are changing the environment. So, for example, with the falling leaves, this chemical change chemical characteristics of the soil underneath of the tree. And there is a hypothesis partly already checked that young individuals of the same species very often have difficulties to develop under the canopy of the mother tree because they would compete with the old tree. So the old trees are, let's say, more interested, if you may say like that, in spreading all of their descendants as far from the mother tree as possible. On the other hand, young trees, young individuals are also not really, dealing well if they grow close to the old tree, because then they are usually more endangered, more threatened by insects, herbivores specialized on the same species. So that's also influence of old trees. And right now, today exactly, I received information that our article was accepted for publishing, which shows that not just size and age of the tree, of old tree is important, but also species of old tree is important, because each species, because of its characteristic, influences the environment in different way.
Okay.
By deeper or lighter shading, by excreting exact chemicals and so on. And that influences species composition of regeneration in the surrounding of the old tree, but also it influences the distance in which next trees may develop to such an old tree. And going further, old trees are also, I would say, multi-habitat ecosystem, because old tree usually includes also some dying branches, some crevices, some holes, some also dead parts of the tree, which offers many microhabitats for insects, for lichens, for mosses to develop. And because they are usually dominating over the canopy of other trees, they offer also different light conditions for the species dependent on them. So I would say that old trees, big trees, are extremely important. And coming back, maybe it's too long already, but coming back to the question of the carbon, old trees accumulate and store a lot of carbon in the forest ecosystem. Just an example of, again, oak in our forest, the average biomass of the trees growing per hectare, that's about 420 cubic meters. One old big oak could be over 40 cubic meters. So it means that one tree, that's 10% of the biomass, which means one old tree, that's 10% of the carbon stored per hectare in this forest. So they store much more carbon than one would think based just on the number of such trees. And despite of general saying, because very often you may hear, especially from the foresters, that they plant young trees because they grow faster, so they fix more carbon. It's not true. Old trees fix a lot of carbon as well, because they have huge crowns, and to simply keep themselves alive and keep themselves expanding, building their bodies, they need to fix a lot of carbon. So old trees are also very important as a fixers and stores of the carbon, stores which are assured for centuries.
It's I don't know this number. It's a very it's like it's not the number of trees important. It's more like the age of tree. It's important.
Not age, size.
Size,
because you know you also must consider that in natural forest, size of the tree is not strongly correlated with the size of the tree.
Okay.
Sometimes, if tree grows under canopy of others, and the tree is shade tolerant, it can be very old, but it will stay thin. So on one side, you may say big tree is old tree, but it doesn't work otherwise. I mean, old tree doesn't have to be big.
Vous nous avez parlé de l'importance de l'âge des arbres et de leur taille, mais aussi de l'importance de la diversité des essences d'arbres. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner un exemple justement de différence entre la diversité des arbres en forêt exploitée ou en forêt sauvage?
When we try to characterize any natural forest, we need to take a very wide spatial scale. Because, as I mentioned, the natural forests are shaped by natural disturbances, which are random, and which means that locally there may be a place, for example, which was affected by wind last year, and you will find all of the trees dead and all of the dead wood lying on the ground, and sometimes even no any living tree, any young tree living there. So if someone will concentrate on too small scale, the picture will be completely fake. And generally, to really understand the forest, we must look at it in the scale of hundreds or even thousands of hectares, because then in such a scale, forest ecosystem, natural forest ecosystem, becomes, let's say, stable and in kind of the equilibrium. So in one place, trees are dying, in other are regenerating. And this, we even call it in mixed deciduous forest the mosaic cycle dynamic, because if someone would map all of these places, it would look like a mosaic of pieces of forests which are differing by species composition, by age of the trees, by openness of the canopy, and so on. And this mosaic is still in move. Something what is very important also to keep in mind, that natural forest is very dynamic. It's changing from month to month or even from day to day, because always some trees are dying, the new are regenerating, some are uprooting. And in effect, natural forest is diverse from many points of view. So the species composition is very diverse. The age of the trees is usually very diverse, because at least in mixed deciduous forests, you will see the big old trees standing and then younger ones around, and generally the lower age of the trees, the higher their numbers per hectare. Then there's a very big diversity of so-called microhabitats which are associated with trees. So holes, dead parts of the trees, dead wood. There are a lot of uprooted trees, which that's again another microhabitat, or even, well, maybe not fully habitat, but microhabitat important for many organisms. Also, deadwood in different stages of decay, that's also kind of the biodiversity. And many of these aspects do not exist in commercial forest, because indeed, in past, many commercial forests were planted as a monocultures, because if you have in the forest just one species, then it's very easy to manage it. You don't have to think about that, for example, neighboring trees are differing in light demands, because they are of the same species. While if you have different species, then you must keep in mind, okay, this tree may grow in the shadow, so it doesn't matter that tree aside is a little higher, and so on. But then the biggest, let's say, problem in commercial forests is with the logging, because then if you have many tree species, you need sorting of the wood, and that generates some costs. Commercial forests also have a much lower diversity of microhabitats, all of the kinds of the microhabitats, they usually contain a very low number of large trees. And here I may offer you some exact numbers. In the Bialowieza National Park, the average, the mean number of so-called monumental trees, so big trees per hectare, is like about 3 trees per 1 hectare. It doesn't sound a lot. A lot of people are saying, well, 3 trees per hectare, what's that? But still staying in Bialowieza forest, just behind the borders of the national park, this number of large trees is close to 100 times lower. So it's like 3 monumental trees per 100 hectares. And if you take the average for the whole country, for the whole Poland, it's even 10 times lower than in the commercial part of the Bialowieza forest. Consider that the commercial part of the Bialowieza forest is commercially used just for 100 years. So such a big change is brought just by 100 years of human management. And the change is really tremendous.
Est-ce que l'exploitation commerciale de la forêt qui a commencé depuis 100 ans à Bialowieza, elle a impacté la forêt sauvage?
Of course, because when we talk about the forest ecosystem, again we must keep in mind that forests are not just the trees, but also animals, also those big ones. So a lot of big animals need large personal ranges. Good example is, for example, lynx, where the one individual needs the area of 100 to 300 square kilometers. And Bialowieza National Park, it's a little more than 100 square kilometers, so it may protect, in the matter of fact, 1 lynx. Okay, let's make 2 or 3 because ranges of females and males can overlap. But it will not sustain the population. So the logging outside of the forest, which brings changes in forest structure, which disturbs animals, definitely influences also the protected area. So the bigger protected area, the better for biodiversity and the better for stability of such a protected area. Because on the big area we may allow for all of the natural factors to really operate, to really shape the forest ecosystem. If protected area is very small, like let's say 100 hectares only, then one windbreak may simply break all of the trees in such a protected area. And then if we talk about the species which are typical for old forests, if such a 100 hectare protected area is surrounded by young commercial forests, the old growth forest species will not recolonize such a place because they are not existing in the landscape. While if the protected area is big, thousands or hundreds of thousands of hectares, then such disturbed areas are easily recolonized by specialized old growth forest species because they are present everywhere around.
Okay, it's about a scale. You can't have a fully biodiversity place without a big scale.
Yes, but of course we must agree that we also need wood. We need production of wood. Yes. We need kind of the mosaic of management, in my opinion. Simply protected areas which are sometimes maybe smaller, but connected by some corridors to each other, which would allow colonization, recolonization of such a places by different species, and which will allow migration of species between the protected areas. And I think we also cannot think that our knowledge about the forest management is absolute. I mean, there are several ways of forest management, but I'm sure there are many more, let's say, management approaches which we can develop in the future, which will also combine at least partly production of wood with protection of at least some kind of biodiversity. So, of course, if we want to have really fully diverse forests, we need a strict protection. And in this case, this biodiversity strategy of European Union, which calls for protection of 30% of land and 10% of strict protection, that's something what really will benefit forest diversity. But we need also a combination of forest management and protection of biodiversity in commercial forests.
Et quels sont les managements forestiers qui sont le moins nocifs pour la biodiversité? Si vous avez des exemples dans le monde, par exemple.
So, even in Europe, there are many such approaches. On one side, in my opinion, the least good approach in the forest management are the large-scale logging sites, which are then replanted artificially. And on the other side of this scale, there are several forest management approaches which are based on logging of individual trees. So it's like following of natural processes and removing just those trees which are, let's say, fully grown and which already at least partly fulfill their ecological role in forest development. However, so far it's also the truth that the more biodiversity friendly is forest management, the more it costs. So it's again a question of the economical approach and some incentives to forest owners and forest managers to compensate the losses, potential losses in their income, if they will apply more ecologically friendly forest management.
Yes, it's losses for economical point of view, but it's a win for biodiversity point of view.
Yes, and well, in the matter of fact, from this point of view, you may say that these are losses for individual owner of the forest, but it increases biodiversity, which means that increases the benefits of the whole society. Because forests are important not just because they produce wood. Forests are very important also for our health, our well-being. There is a very, let's say, I may say global approach now called One Health, which the philosophy behind it is that our health of humans, depends on health of other species and health of ecosystems. So if we want to be healthy and we want to be happy, we need green, diverse forests. However, it's very difficult to show for a forest manager that we are benefited, so you should change management of your forests.
On le ressent directement, ce bien-être, quand on est en forêt pour notre corps et pour notre esprit. Je pense aussi au Japon qui développe les bains de forêt. Est-ce que vous avez des études qui prouvent justement que la forêt est bénéfique pour nous?
Yes, recently there are many such articles which are published each month. This year there was a paper published by German team which showed that in the scale of the whole country, whole Germany, the well-being of people, physical and mental well-being, is correlated with diversity of forests. So in the regions of Germany where forests are more natural, more diverse, people are happier, healthier, and so on. As I said, each month recently such papers are published, and it's becoming obvious. However, there are many obvious things published by scientists which are not implemented in the real world. The good example is the climate change, about which scientists are publishing paper for 30 or 40 years already. And many of these papers were alarming, and we may say that we still do almost nothing about it.
On le voit encore avec le dernier rapport du GIEC qui alarme déjà depuis des années sur le changement climatique, qui va continuer à s'accélérer si on ne fait rien. Et d'ailleurs, comment les arbres ils vont réagir à ce changement dans leurs conditions de vie et dans leurs conditions de croissance?
Let's hope that they can. But this is only our hope. In case of trees, the same as in case of other organisms, it's a question of maybe not adaptation, but their ability to migrate, to change their borders of their distribution. And many scientific models show that in the future the species composition of our forests will change dramatically. In case of Poland, there was a study published 2-3 years ago by Didecki et al., which showed that in the next 50 years we will lose most of conifer trees, so pines, spruces, which are now dominating in the forest, and they will be replaced by deciduous trees. However, with the modeling approaches, I have a big problem because they are based on the situation in the past, and conditions in the future are not always, let's say, developing linearly, and very often new factors arrive unexpectedly. For example, like modeling approaches taking into account climatic conditions in Europe still do not consider influence of the very strong winds and so on, which are now more and more common, and their frequency is increasing. So I'm afraid that our models are not really expressing what will happen in the future. We just may say certainly the change will be very, very large. Okay. And then many colleagues, many scientists keep saying that the future doesn't have that we cannot predict the future development of our ecosystems based on the past situation in the ecosystems, because changes are too quick, and very often the environmental factors are changing much stronger, much wider than in past. There are more extreme temperatures, the extremes are higher. So if such a things did not occur in past, we cannot predict based on the past how they will influence future ecosystems. And that's, as I said, it's not just a question of trees, it considers all of these species.
Et est-ce que par rapport au passé, dans le présent, vous voyez déjà des changements liés justement au changement climatique?
There are many changes. There are many changes which you observe, and some of them are quite easy to spot, like for example arriving of some warm demanding species, and if the species is easy moving, is very mobile, then it arrives very quickly. For example, 20 years ago, the praying mantis, that's the insect which is predatory. Praying mantis was known in Poland just from southeastern part of Poland and just from 1 or 2 spots. It was extremely rare on the list of endangered species. And during the last 20 years, it colonized almost the whole country. Here in Bialowieza forest, we have its population for the last 15 years. And now I see this insect each year many times. At the beginning, when it occurs, it's very, let's say, emblematic. So people turn their attention. It's a very characteristic species. So even if they don't know the insects, they spot, whoa, that's something strange. So at the beginning, I received many calls from people. Oh, I saw something strange. They sent the picture of them and so on. For the last 5 years, they stopped simply because the species become common, become part of the forest. Another change which is easy to observe is change in species composition of wood stands, if they also take place rapidly, like spruce dieback, caused by attack of this spruce bark beetle. Spruce is the species of tree which demands low temperatures during the winter and high air humidity. So with the rising temperatures, which are rising especially during the winter months, because winter months are warming the quickest, and higher temperature means also drier air. These trees are becoming vulnerable for attacks of beetles, and even in past, usually each decade we had a massive outbreak of those beetles, but they were not so, let's say, so harsh. Recently, we witnessed a very large outbreak which reduced the number of spruces by, I don't know, 30-40%. So it's visible. It's visible, and it's visible both in the protected area, because there are many dead spruces standing in the forest, as well as in the places where foresters intervened because they logged these trees. So there are open areas which are left after the logging. But there are also changes which are not so obvious and which needs a long-term data. Our station has permanent plots on which we study phenology of plants. Phenology, it's a science about the dates of development of flowers, leaves, and so on of plants. And we carried these observations since beginning of 1960s. And we revealed that early springtime flowers are now flowering about 2 weeks earlier than it was in 1960s. So not just species composition, but also phenology of species is changing. And it considers not just plants, but also there were several studies published from here which show that many bird species are now starting to nest for a week or month or more than week earlier than it was in past. So it's a reaction of organisms on increasing temperatures. But on the other hand, it brings also some risks. And last year we published a paper which shows that with the warming springs, the risks which are associated with so-called late frosts are increasing. Because in spite of the fact that we have warmer springs, extreme temperatures happen still with quite a high frequency. So if plants develop earlier, then they are very strongly damaged by the late frosts, so the drops of the temperatures below the zero. And this risk, in the matter of fact, is increasing with the warming climate.
All the forest is moving, try to adapt, but it's like confused for the forest. I have the impression like the insect attacked some tree to maybe make some place for new to coming, and they try to. It's like a moving thing.
Yeah, I agree. These are mechanisms which are adapting the forest ecosystem to new environmental conditions.
Yeah.
In case of spruce, Bialowieza forest was at the southwestern border of its climatic range. So farther south or farther west from Bialowieza forest on the Polish lowland, spruce was not growing naturally.
Okay.
And it was stopped here by the climate, exactly by too warm and too dry conditions farther. So with the climate change, such edge populations are affected very strongly. So decrease in the share of spruces in our stands, it's simply the answer of the ecosystem for the global warming. And in past, such a processes allowed for trees to survive during the glaciation, because the tree species were pushed to, let's say, Mediterranean basin or to other warmer, safe places, from which they recolonize Europe. But the problem which we are facing now with the climate change, with recent climate change, is that the changes are taking part very quickly, much quicker than was documented for the historical warmings or coolings and so on, which means that many species will be not able to follow the speed of change. And that's our main concern, that for example, spruce will die here because it will be too warm, but it will not have enough time to colonize those conditions, those geographical, let's say, spaces, which are suitable recently or becoming suitable recently for the species. And we also must keep in mind that not all of the species have any place to move. If we are talking about the species growing in the mountains, With the warming climate, they are going up, but they can't go over the peaks. The same is with the most northern species. With the warming, they will move up north, but just to the certain limit, and they have no way to go farther. So I'm afraid that the climate change will also bring a lot of losses in diversity of forests.
Comment les arbres peuvent migrer et à quelle vitesse?
But I'm afraid again it depends. Each species have different adaptations to dispersal. So some species are adapted to wind dispersal, and then their seeds can be transported by wind normally for a few hundred hectares, sometimes, a few hundred meters, or a few kilometers. That's, let's say, efficient distance of the dispersal by wind. Sometimes, in extreme situations, species occur in very, very far distances. But these are, let's say, the mechanisms which are very difficult to foresee and which are very random. Like we may imagine, for example, the very strong hurricane or twister, which take seeds from one place and then deposit them 100 kilometers farther. It happens, but certainly it is not rather able to assure that diversity, that all of the species will move. It may be beneficial for 1-2 species. Another 3 species, or another species, are dependent on animal vectors. And in this case, limiting factor are barriers in the landscape. Because some animal species sometimes migrate, travel for dozens of kilometers, but recently European landscape is cut through roads, highways and so on, very often fenced on both sides. So the migration of species is also very difficult for this reason. And taking into account that each species has different abilities of traveling, we rather cannot say that the forest will migrate. Because with the moving up north, because that's the general direction of the moving of most of the species, so with the moving up north, some species will be faster, the others will be slower, the others will disappear. Some species which were present there at the northern side will stay there. So the new ecosystems will be different than we observe now. And that's also something which we must accept, that forests, that nature is changing, that it is dynamic. So we really cannot expect that, for example, such a mixed deciduous forest as we have in Bialowieza forest now, that they will be relocated 500 kilometers farther north. Even if they will redevelop there, they will be different.
Peut-on aider la nature à s'adapter ou vaut mieux-il laisser faire la nature?
I think both approaches are needed. Because there is such an approach in nature conservation which is called assisted migration, which calls exactly for relocating of species if they cannot move because they are too slow. or if they don't have a possibility to move farther because they are, as we said, those mountain species on the peak, then we can take such a species from one peak and move artificially to the higher one or to those which are more northern. But such approach is practical just in case of single species. And if we consider ecosystems like natural forests here in Bialowieza, where we are talking about over 1,000 species of plants, several thousand species of fungi, about 30 to 40,000 species of animals. We cannot assist all of them, and we are even not able to, well, we are not aware that some of them exist there. So helping for natural processes, natural migration in simply way which is creation of migration corridors, assuring that species may migrate naturally, is also extremely important. So both approaches are needed, and I think it needs adjustment according to the species, according to how rare it is.
Pouvez-vous nous expliquer la succession forestière? Comment une forêt devient une forêt?
I would say these are two a little bit different processes.
Okay.
The natural succession, so colonization of not forested land by forest, takes place in a little different way because it starts in the place where there are no forest organisms. So it's a building of ecosystem anew. It usually takes much longer, and it includes several successional stages. So, for example, in the case of forests in temperate climate, for example, abandoned agricultural lands are at the first stage colonized by so-called pioneering tree species. Those are trees which are light demanding, which produce millions of seeds, usually airborne, transported by wind, like birch, like poplars. And owing to this adaptation, they easily colonize open areas, even far from the forest, because wind brings a lot of seeds. When they develop, under their canopy may establish shadow-tolerant species, which usually have heavier seeds. So there must be some source, at least some single sources of seeds of such a species. They are very often transported by animals. Like, for example, in the case of oak, this would be squirrels or jays in case of birds, which transport acorns for few kilometers even, and they are responsible for planting of oaks under canopy of birches. Then, because birches are quite short-living, after 100-150 years, that's a short time for forest, birches start to die, and because underneath there is already this middle successional forest which creates deeper shade, then pioneers have rather low chances to re-establish themselves again. So they die and they are replaced by shadow tolerance. And then even between those shadow tolerant species, there are species which tolerate deeper shade or lower shade. And those which are the most shadow tolerant, like for example beech, They are called late successional species, and they are able sometimes to dominate the whole area because they may regenerate under their own canopies. So they outcompete all of the other species, which needs at least small gaps in the forest to develop. Because beech may develop under its own canopy, so when the old tree is dying, there are already young ones waiting and closing the canopy. They don't give any chances for those earlier successional species to develop. So that's the successional, let's say, development. Its end point depends a little bit on type of the forest, or exactly on the species building the forest. Because in case of the geographical range with the beech, we may say that the beech forest is the final stage of succession on quite fertile soils, because beech may outcompete the other species. While in our geographical range, where we don't have beech, because it didn't colonize the area after glaciation, situation is much more complicated. Because I think that the final stage of this succession is mixed deciduous forest, but it is very diverse. I mean, locally it may be dominated by oaks, maples, hornbeams, or other species. So there is no really a good unified picture of this final stage of succession. It's very variable. However, again, in scale of several thousand of hectares, we may say it's more or less stable. And the forest life cycle is a little different story, because when gap opens in the forest, usually the sources of seeds or sources of, let's say, other organisms, also insects, animals, are around of such an open gap. So the recolonization is much faster. Very often it doesn't include those pioneering species, light-demanding species, because gap is very often too small for light-demanding species to develop. So regeneration starts when old trees are dying. Species composition of at least trees depends then on size of the clearing, size of the gap. On the smaller ones develop just shadow tolerance. On the bigger ones may develop also those species which are more light demanding. And that includes not just the trees, but also, for example, insects or other animals like lizards and so on. If gap is too small, it's too cold for lizards or frogs, which are depending on the temperature of the air. So they occupy just rather bigger sites. And then with the regeneration, forest is going through next phases, so the juvenile phase, then the so-called optimal phase of forest. Optimal because according to the forestry sciences, that's the age in which forest should be logged, because that's the maximum of the speed of the growth of the trees. After a certain age, trees are increasing their volume slower. So from economical point of view, it's smart to replace them by the younger ones, which grow faster. But even in natural forest, we call it optimal phase. Then it's the phase of aging, when forest gets older and some trees are starting to die. And then there is a phase of decomposition of the stand when many trees are dying, many gaps are occurring, and that opens for regeneration of new trees. And generally, I may say that there are two main mechanisms, or three main mechanisms, which are shaping such a regeneration of natural forests. One is so-called continuous regeneration, and such a continuous regeneration takes place in the forests built by shadow tolerance. So the beech, the silver fir, Abies alba, and other species, which may develop under their own canopy. So usually there are no big gaps in such a forest. Regeneration is continuous under canopy of old trees, and simply when old tree dies, young ones are already there. Second mechanism, second scenario, is a gap dynamic, which is typical for mixed deciduous forest built by different tree species. And then you've got those smaller or bigger clearings and development of trees according to their light demands, but also according to, let's say, their life strategies, because some trees, even in mixed deciduous forest, are, let's say, cheating the others because they are shadow tolerant. So they also develop so-called seedling banks under canopy of old trees. So if gap opens, they're already there. They are first, and they are able to outcompete locally the others. So a lot depends on ecology of species. But if there are many species building this stand, then each tree species must have such a own strategy, which makes it more successful in some situations. And the third scenario, which is usually characteristic for boreal forests, or in our climatic zone for conifer forests growing in, let's say, poorest habitats like pine forests. It's a large scale scenario in which the forest is usually disturbed on a large scale, hundreds or even thousands of hectares, by windbreaks, by fires, by insect outbreaks, and regeneration takes place anew on a very large area. And such a forests, then even if they are natural, the stand structure is very often quite similar to what we see in commercial forests. They're very often built by just one or two species in the same age and so on. When we look at the structure of the natural forest, we must always keep in mind the fact that it depends on climatic zone and on species composition of stand and on habitat type.
Quel est votre endroit préféré dans la forêt?
Obviously, it's a core area of the national park. So this most natural part of the forest, and that's because it's very diverse in sense of landscape and forest structure. So it's possible to find darker places and more open places where you've got just the big trees, and places where big trees are associated with the young ones growing around. And then, according to the season of the year, it also offers a lot of aesthetic values which change from place to place. Mixed deciduous forests, for example, during springtime are rich in flowers. During April, May, they look like carpet of white flowers with some yellow and blue flowers in between them. During the spring, during the autumn, when leaves are changing colors, diverse stands are also very colorful. But also, very often dead trees, the fungi growing on dead trees, uprooted trees, they look like kind of the art. So when I go to such a forest, I even can't expect what I will see. It's always a surprise. And obviously, it's also important that each time when I am going there, even into the places which I know, I'm sure that they changed. So it's always a surprise. It's always something new, always something what I may learn, which awakes new questions, which puts new question marks on how it works, why it works like that, why it looks like that, and so on.
Comment vous vous sentez quand vous êtes dans la forêt? Quelles sont les émotions qui se déclenchent chez vous?
Well, I think dominating feeling is that in such a place I feel how small I am, how unimportant is a human in the forest, and how short is our life in comparison to the life of trees and to the length of the forest life cycle. Simply, I feel like, well, in the middle of something huge and much, much stronger, much, much more important than myself.